All right, let's settle in for this one because this is a conversation that doesn't get had enough. And when it does, it's usually whispered at the back of a show or talked about instead of talked through. Today, we're talking about aging out of comic books, not quitting the hobby, not losing interest, aging out. And this applies to everybody at any age, whether you want to admit it or not. Because aging out isn't about how old you are, it's about time. Time, energy, patience, and margin. And eventually, no matter when you started collecting, time becomes the scarcest resource that you have. For some collectors, aging out happens in their 30s. They get careers, families grow, priorities shift. You still love comics, but you don't have the bandwidth to chase shows, track auctions, manage submissions the way you once did. For others, it happens later, much later, in their 60s or 70s. And that's where this conversation gets a little uncomfortable, but very necessary. Because let's be clear here, there's absolutely nothing wrong with collecting into your 60s and 70s. I know plenty of collectors that are those ages that enjoy it just the same. In fact, some of the best collections in this hobby belong to people in that age range. These are the builders, the long-term thinkers. These are the people who bought their books off the rack, stored them carefully, and never even imagined they'd be worth what they are today. They just loved it then, the same way they still love it now. There's a passion in that. Still stuck around even though the game changed. But there comes a point where I'm a collector quietly turns into I'm a custodian. And that transition matters. And so when collectors reach an age where time is no longer an abstract idea, exits start to look a little bit different. You're not talking about upgrading copies anymore. You're not chasing trends. You're thinking about simplification. You're thinking about liquidity. You're thinking about what happens if you don't handle this yourself. And this is where a lot of people get stuck because there's a common scenario in this hobby. An older collector knows intellectually that they should start selling, but emotionally, they're anchored to prices from the peak, or to what a dealer once told them, or to what a book should be worth because of the story behind it. And that hesitation costs them time they really don't have, frankly. And when I say don't have time, I don't mean that disrespectfully at all. I mean that literally. In your 60s or 70s, time has a different weight to it. Waiting 5 years for the perfect buyer is not the same bet it is when you're 35 years old. Holding out for top dollar because it'll come back assumes that there's a runway that might not exist. And this is where pricing becomes everything. Older collectors who are exiting need to price their books fairly and move on. The end, period. No fire price sales, not getting taken advantage of, but reasonable prices that reflect the current, mind you, I said current, not 6 years ago, the current as in today, 2026 market values that we are in. Not the market from 10 years ago, not the market from 5 years ago, or any of the ones that they wish would return. Because here's the hard truth. The buyers for these books are younger. They're young people. Young people probably with some amount of resources. They have different reference points, different budgets, different expectations. They're not emotionally attached to these books the way that you are. They don't care what you paid for it or what you think it's worth or how long you've owned it. They care about what are the comps, what's the condition, what are the alternatives. Because if they can find something similar for cheaper, they're not going to buy your book. There has to be a coming down to reality. When it's time to go, when it's time to part ways with your stuff, come down to reality and get rid of it. If you're not being reasonable, then the books won't move. They'll just sit there. Comics tend to move slowly anyways. They're not commodity items. They move slow. Even great books, they move slow. And sitting is the enemy when you are aging out. There's also a deep nuance here about how people view money. Because to someone in their 70s, an extra 10 or 20% on a book might be meaningful compared to the principle of not leaving money on the table. To a younger buyer, that same premium might be the difference between buying the book or walking away entirely. I mean, we've got different generations of people here that view money very differently, trying to do deals with each other, trying to sell and to buy. Think about people that you know in your life. And this is comics aside. Think about people that you know in your life. Your wife, your kids, your friends. Do they all think about money the way you think about it? Absolutely not. Nobody does. Money also means different things at different stages of life. For younger collectors, cash flow matters. Liquidity matters. Opportunity cost matters. They're balancing mortgages, families, investments, collecting, whatever. If a book is priced too high, they'll just move on to the next copy. And there always is another copy. This is why exits need structure. One of the best things that an aging collector can do is to work with a major auction house like Heritage, ComicConnect, ComicLink. These platforms remove friction. They expose your books to global buyer bases, and they establish market-driven pricing. Nobody has to guess. Nobody has to argue. Nobody has to go back and forth. Most importantly, they get things done. Nobody's dealing with tire kickers. You're not answering endless messages. You're not negotiating emotionally. You're letting the market take hold. And so are there fees? Obviously. Yes, there's fees, but those fees often replace months or years of effort, stress, uncertainty. And to someone who values time more than incremental gains, that trade-off makes sense. Now, there's also something else that I need to say, and I need to say it plainly. Because doing this while you are still alive is an act of responsibility. Too many collections end up being liquidated by families who have no idea what they're dealing with. They don't have any understanding of grades. They have no sense of fair value. They're not connected to the community or the hobby. They don't have a network of buyers. They've got boxes of comics and a vague awareness that these are probably worth something. It was important to my dad or my husband or whatever. They have no idea. And that lack of information creates burden. And I get what everybody's thinking because I've thought about it too. That's the nightmare scenario. That's everything you've got being left with people that don't really understand it. And so what are the fears that go on in our minds? That they're going to get ripped off. That this stuff's going to be sold for way less. They're going to get ripped off. And obviously you won't be aware of it because you'll be dead. But these are the things that we stress out about. It's an emotional burden. It's a logistical burden. It's a financial burden. Families either get overwhelmed and sell everything to the first dealer who shows up, God forbid, or they hold on to books for years, frozen by fear of making a mistake, not knowing what to do. And neither outcome honors the collection. When you handle your own exit, you control the narrative. You decide what goes where. You document the values. You make the introductions. You remove the guilt. You turn what could be a stressful problem into a clean transition. And then you can be there to watch your family enjoy it too. And yes, it's bittersweet. There's no way around that. Letting go of a collection is like letting go of a version of yourself. The hunts, the wins, the shows, friendship, stories tied to each book and how you got it. That stuff doesn't just disappear just because the books do, but it still feels like closing a chapter. But necessary things are often bittersweet. And a well-timed exit isn't a failure. It's the final act of good collecting, and we all have to go through it. It's understanding that ownership of what we have is temporary, but stewardship matters. It's recognizing when the role shifts from accumulation to distribution. And here's the part that applies to everybody listening, regardless of your age. You don't need to be 60 or 70 years old to think about this. You just need to be honest about where you are and where you're going. Collections should serve your life, not complicate it. If you love your books, keep them. If you don't have the time, energy, or desire anymore, then let them move on. There's always a next generation of collectors ready to care for them, but they're only going to do that if the handoff makes sense. Aging out isn't about walking away from comics. It's about choosing how you walk away and making sure that the people you leave behind aren't stuck trying to figure out a story you never wrote down. And if nothing else, that's worth thinking about now, long before you have to.